Okay, everyone, welcome back. In this lecture, we're going to finish up Chapter 4. We're going to go over Section 4.5 on nervous tissue and 4.6 on tissue injury and aging. So let's start with nervous tissue. Nervous tissue is excitable, and it's capable of sending and receiving these electrochemical signals that provide the body with information. There are two main cell types in the nervous tissue, the neuron and the neuroglia. Neurons are able to propagate information via electrochemical impulses called action potentials. These are then biochemically linked to the release of chemical signals. And so really, it's like what you'll see when I show you what a neuron looks like. It's these electricity impulses that travel down a neuron and then are linked to the release of chemicals. It's really, really interesting. Then the neuroglia, we'll talk about at the end here, they support neurons and they modulate their information propagation. And a lot of new research is determining exactly what neuroglia do. So let's keep going. There's three main parts of a neuron: the cell body, dendrites, and the axon. The cell body is where most of the cytoplasm and organelles are held. The dendrites branch off of the cell body, and the axon is a long tail-like structure that extends from the neuron body. The axon can actually be wrapped in an insulating layer called myelin. And myelin is just something that increases the speed at which those electrochemical impulses are conducted. Here's what a neuron looks like. Here's the cell body, which remember contains the nucleus and most of the organelles. Here are the extensions off the cell body called dendrites. Here is an axon, which is the tail. The axon moves this way down to the axon terminal where it ends. The gap between nerve cells, or between a nerve cell and its target, maybe a muscle cell, is called the synapse. The impulse is carried across the synapse by chemical compounds known as neurotransmitters. So the impulse starts here, travels all the way down the axon. You can see here, there's the impulse moving down the axon into the end of the axon where this terminal synapse is. And here's a synapse where you see synaptic vesicles pinching off, releasing the neurotransmitter, and the neurotransmitter going across to the dendrites of the next neuron. Let's talk about the neuroglia. There are, like I said, support cells, and new research is shedding light on their complex role of the glial cells in the brain and the nervous system. We have cells called astrocyte cells, and they're named because they look like stars, so that's what astro means. They are abundant in the central nervous system. They are said to regulate ion concentration in the intercellular space. They uptake or break down neurotransmitters, and they help form the blood-brain barrier. Then we have oligodendrocyte cells, which produce the myelin that covers the axon in the brain and spinal cord, which is a central nervous system, while Schwann cells produce myelin in the peripheral nervous system. Okay, so that was the really basic breakdown of Chapter 4.5. Let's look at Chapter 4.6, Tissue Injury and Aging. Let's look at this word inflammation. Inflammation is the standard and the first response that a body has to injury. Inflammation limits the extent of injury, the cause of the injury, and initiates repair and regeneration of damaged tissue. So it's the first thing that happens when you get some sort of injury. So there's two types of cell death. Necrosis, which is non-programmed cell death, basically anytime a cell dies when it wasn't supposed to, or apoptosis, which is the exact opposite of that. When a cell is no longer needed or is too old, it is programmed to die, and that is called apoptosis. Chronic inflammation is actually a really bad thing. It actually leads to disease. Some examples of that are arthritis and tuberculosis. So let's just keep moving here. There's four cardinal signals of inflammation, and people have known this for a very, very long time. They are redness, swelling, pain, and localized heat. You'll read in your chapter that this was first written down by Cornelius Celsus, and he was alive during the days of the Roman Empire. And so we've always been keenly aware of inflammation, and if you've ever, when you have experienced inflammation, it's hard not to be aware of it, right? A fifth sign of inflammation could be a loss of function, but that is also sort of rare when it comes to just normal inflammation. Once tissues are damaged, cells will release chemical signals that evoke vasodilation, and basically that's opening up of blood cells to bring a lot of blood to that area, which is one of the reasons why you turn bright red. Then remember we have those cells called mast cells that release histamine. And histamine, along with the vasodilation, recruits white blood cells to the site. Histamine will also cause local vessels to become leaky, which can bring excess fluid containing a lot of different things to the area. That causes swelling, or swelling is called edema, which causes pain receptors to be pressed against and you start to feel pain. Also, things that when you have injured cells, you have things called prostaglandins being released, and prostaglandins also activate pain receptors. So, NSAIDs are basically a non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs like aspirin, Tylenol, or Advil can block prostaglandins, which helps to reduce pain. You can also take antihistamines like Benadryl or Claritin to block histamine receptors and stop the histamine response. Let's talk about how tissues repair themselves. The first is by clotting. Clotting begins after the injury has been contained due to swelling. It reduces blood loss from the damaged blood vessels. It'll trap blood cells to the surface that will bind the edges of the wound together. Then we get, you're pretty familiar with this, a scab, which forms and it reduces the chance of infection. It basically stops things from the outside from getting in. And then remember those cells called fibroblasts from the connective tissue. Well, they make more connective tissue to replace the collagen and other material that was lost. And then we have something called angiogenesis, which is the growth of new blood vessels that vascularizes the new tissue, which just allows new blood vessels to be in the new tissue that you have to replace. Let's talk about getting scars. Maybe you've had a scar before from falling when you were a kid. There's two types of healing. The first is a primary union. A primary union describes the healing of a wound where the edges are already close together. So it's just a small injury, and so you already are healing a wound where it's not very deep. A secondary union occurs as the edges of a wound are pulled together by what is called wound contraction. If a wound is more than 1/4 of an inch deep, doctors will recommend to promote stitches to promote a primary union, because primary unions will generally not leave scars. However, if you don't bring the edges close together and the wound has to do what is called wound contraction, you may be left with a disfiguring scar. Okay, so that was tissue death and repair. Let's just talk about tissue aging. All cells, all humans, all life in general are affected by senescence, which is just the deterioration due to the passage of time. Ralph Waldo Emerson, right? He said the surest poison is time, right? Nobody beats time. Time is win percentage is 100%, right? You can see that depending as well, based on people's lifestyles, that aging happens quite differently. You can see somebody who may have drank alcohol and smoked cigarettes their whole life compared to somebody who didn't do that, and you might see someone that looks exactly the same but is 20 years younger than somebody who didn't do that. So just as exterior signs of aging are seen, right, like atrophy, which is where your muscles lose mass, joints will stiffen, your hair will turn white, your face will look flabby because you lose the elastic collagen fibers and your muscle tone. Just as we see that on the outside, there are also signs on the inside as well, like disease increases, you get a lot more likely to get cancer and other things like that. Wound healing is slower and infection rates increase. Aging is also apparent at the cellular level, and it's a pretty interesting thing called telomeres. Telomeres are the ends of chromosomes. And basically, without getting too in-depth with it right now, telomeres basically are there because every time you replicate your chromosomes, a bit of those chromosomes are sort of sloughed off at the end. And telomeres are there for that reason, because they don't code for any proteins, so they can be lost and cut off, and none of your proteins that are eventually made from the DNA are affected. However, since you're reproducing these cells over and over and over again every day for your entire life, eventually the telomeres run out and you start getting into protein coding DNA. And when that happens, cells are not going to be able to replicate normally. Some of the proteins that they need are going to be affected. And this can either lead to cancers or just cells that don't work as good as they should. And this is one of the examples of why cells in general age. And so it's kind of interesting. There's actually an enzyme that is supposed to replace telomeres, and it does a good job for the most part. And people have looked into increasing that enzyme's activity in order to increase a person's normal life span. However, all of the research has led to the organisms they've been trying to test on developing cancer. And so it might be something that we figure out in the future, but we haven't figured it out just yet. But studies, to leave you on a little brighter note, studies show that exercise and a healthy lifestyle can slow down aging. And so that's where I'm going to leave this one here. Congratulations, you finished chapter 4. Please move on to chapter 5. If you have any questions, like I said, please feel free to email me or get in touch in my virtual office. Bye now.